All right, I'm speaking with former Costa Rican President Oscar Arias. He was in Seattle for several speaking engagements, and we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the comments he made today, our relationship with Latin America in general, and Costa Rica's example as sort of a beacon of progress in a difficult, sometimes difficult region, which the United States, in some senses, helped create some of those difficulties, and we'll talk about that. One of the main questions I wanted to ask you, Mr. President, is Mauricio, when he introduced you, mentioned how the United States has ignored Latin America on many fronts, and you mentioned how there's been no foreign aid to speak of to many of these countries, despite many of the needs down there. And we used to give a lot of military aid, but now with all the needs in education and health and so forth, would you agree that the United States is not paying enough attention to the needs of Latin America?
Yes, of course. Yes, well, with the end of the Cold War, everything changed for us because of the threat of communism. The U.S. during many decades was involved trying to support emerging democracies in the region, and sometimes supporting military dictatorships. But the fear of communism made Washington be more generous
with military aid.
Military aid, but also economic aid.
Okay, all right.
Now that there is no threat anymore, all was cut. The reason is because these are middle-income countries, but middle-income countries with huge amounts of poverty. Countries like Brazil, like Ecuador, like Mexico, like those in Central America, huge amounts of poverty. We've been relatively successful in reducing poverty, but not enough. And of course, aid would be very helpful. But the U.S. is among the OECD countries or industrialized countries, one of the countries that is given less aid as a percentage of GDP to developing countries
in general,
in the entire world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're also, you've been a very big proponent of investment as well, and I guess my question is why you spoke today about the signs of progress, especially for which you won the Nobel Peace Prize in sort of ending civil conflict throughout the region. What is it that the United States could do, either the business community as well as U.S. government? What would be, if you could make it happen, what would be the one or two things that you would like to see us doing as sort of fulfilling this obligation you spoke of as, assisting our neighbors? What would be something we could do to really make a difference right now, in addition to more foreign aid?
Well, American companies are invested in Latin America. And my country is a good example of, we've been very successful in attracting high-tech industries, particularly U.S. companies to my country. Because, they choose Costa Rica because it's a stable country, it's a democracy, with a rule of law, we respect individual liberties, etc. And we have well-trained, skillful, well-trained labor force, and good professionals, good engineers, computer scientists, etc. But it seems to me that it is in the interest of Washington, of the U.S. government, to have more prosperous countries to the south.
Sure.
Because poverty needs no passport to travel.
Right.
And the issue of immigration is a huge issue here. But as long as we don't succeed in alleviating the poverty of the Latin American peoples, you know, their dream is to come to this country. And I don't want to see the U.S. keep building walls to prevent poor people from entering into this country.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in your own interest. You don't need to be generous.
Mm-hmm.
It's in your own interest to make your neighbors more prosperous nations.
Well, and one of the questions or issues that a lot of people pay attention to in this country, if they're paying attention to issues in Latin America, we had an interruption. One of the issues we're paying attention to in this country is violence in Latin America. And you won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Arias Peace Plan that put an end to a lot of the civil conflict down there. And yet there's still a lot of violence in Latin America. And one of the statements you made today was the superpowers supply us with the weapons and Latin America supplies the bodies, historically. And a lot of people think that the violence today is related to the war on drugs. And again, I think a lot of Americans just shrug their shoulders. But what do you think is driving the problem with violence in many countries in Latin America? Where does that come from?
Well, it is true that Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are perhaps the three most violent countries on earth. And I believe there are several factors that explain your question. To begin with, lack of opportunities for young people. Young people 25 years ago were involved in the guerrillas or in the regular armies of these nations. And they had no opportunity to study. So they find themselves miserable today. Then you have the drug trafficker. We are unable to fight successfully drug traffickers in our countries. There is a lot of corruption in the armies and sometimes in the police, but we don't have the resources. It's such a huge business, and as long as there is a demand in this country, there will be illegal drugs, going
in the United States, the demand comes from.
Going through the Central American countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I would mention one additional factor. During the war years, many young people left these countries and came to the United States. They went to Chicago, they went to New York, they went to LA, and they got involved in gangs. Mm-hmm. And then they were expelled and sent back to their own countries.
After learning how to be a gang.
Live in this violence through
Right.
the gangs, or what we call maras nowadays.
Right. Well, and I mean, I believe, if I remember correctly, that you favor some kind of lessening of a law enforcement approach to drugs and maybe not legalization of everything, but is that correct? You think we need to end this law enforcement or militarized approach to drugs and approach it more as a health problem?
Yeah. Well, if we could provide more opportunities to these young people, to begin with better education. The dropout rate is very high, and these are people without opportunities. In these countries, because of that violence, there is little investment, both domestic as well as foreign. So it's a vicious
Sure.
circle.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, that one of the fellows you posed with for photographs today is a former member of the Reagan administration. I talked with him a little bit before he posed with you, and I said, well, you guys didn't like this guy too much when he was president, did you? And he said no, that they felt you were too friendly with communists and too left-wing. And so you see those kind of stories, and then you often see, you can see stories talking about you as if you were a tool of the imperialists, or part of worked closely hand in glove with the CIA. I mean, I see both of these kinds of stories. So to me, as a journalist, that probably means you're doing the right thing. But how do you view all of these ways of characterizing what you were like as president? I mean, were you too friendly to the U.S., or were you, you weren't Hugo Chavez, but, some people thought you were not friendly enough. Too independent.
Too independent, yeah. When Vice President Bush visited me for my inauguration, I told Vice President Bush, I want you to know that we are very good friends. But friends sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. And concerning your policy to end the conflicts in the region, I strongly disagree with the Reagan administration. So he knew it. I had campaigned on the need of a negotiated solution to the conflicts in the region. So when I finally introduced my peace plan at the beginning of '87, it was after I visited President Reagan at the White House in December of '86. And I realized that he was so committed to a military solution that I had to do something. Because I didn't want my country to get involved in the conflicts of the region. And then I drafted my peace plan. To tell you the truth, for a small country like mine, insignificant in population and territory, to confront the two superpowers, because it was not only the
That's
U.S.,
true. No.
it was also the Soviet Union and Mikhail Gorbachev with Fidel Castro as his ally. It wasn't easy. It was a David fighting two Goliaths at the same time. And that was the main disagreement. After I addressed to the U.S. Congress and I asked to give peace a chance to the U.S. members of Congress, only at the very end, because you remember that the Reagan administration supported Contras until the very end. And you remember the Iran-Contra affair and all that. Now, 20 years later, I become president again. There is a Republican again in the White House, President Bush.
The other one.
Bush Jr.
Yeah.
I am in favor of CAFTA. I come to Washington to ask support for CAFTA because it is important for us, for the Central American people, to be able to export without paying taxes to the U.S. market, as well as for you to export your goods and services to Central America without paying taxes. I asked my friends for support, the Democrats who supported my peace plan, And they tell me, no, we're against CAFTA. So then I suddenly realized that they were not in favor of my peace plan. They were against Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are not against CAFTA. They are against President Bush.
Politics. Well, and what? Okay, so I know you have to go. One of the things you mentioned here in this talk was that you talked about some of the lessons you've learned in Costa Rica and doing some very progressive things, demilitarization, the biodiversity project, which we haven't had a chance to talk to you about, but that's a big thing. And I guess the last question I wanted to ask you is that right now in the United States, inequality is at record levels. And a lot of people here are also not paying taxes, as you spoke about, is a problem throughout Latin America. What advice would you give to Americans that we should do that maybe you learned from some of the successes in Costa Rica? What is it we need to do to save our country from going the wrong direction?
Well, inequality is increasing almost everywhere. The exception might be the Nordic countries.
Scandinavia.
Scandinavian countries, yes. Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden. But there are two ways how you can combat inequality. Through public spending and through taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Taxes need to be progressive. The wealthy need to pay more. Because as I mentioned, for instance, in Latin America, the tax burden is very low. It's about 18% of GDP. And the Gini coefficient doesn't change before paying taxes and after paying taxes. In a country like Sweden, the Gini coefficient is completely different after paying taxes, because taxes are very progressive. And then you spend more on poor people.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
On the people who need more services, who need better education, who need to finish their high school and go to college. And if you don't have the money, cut military spending. You don't need to spend $700 billion.
I enjoyed your comment about who Brazil was worried about. They were going to get invaded by who, and what did they need submarines for? But, well, I really appreciate your time. Welcome to Seattle, and you're quite an inspiration to all of us, and appreciate you visiting us and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.